Heather, there we have 19 and 20-year-old students defying the master of a Yale college and telling him that it's his job to create a place of comfort and home. What are we to make of this?
It's the Cultural Revolution. This is the nadir of American education. This sort of insanity, the narcissistic victimology of these students thinking of themselves as oppressed at Yale is the height of delusion. And yet they are a product of the Yale bureaucracy. They are being encouraged in this sort of complete hysteria. Another moment in this 3-hour tirade that was directed at Nicholas Christakis.
We gave it, what was it, 30 seconds
30
of something
seconds.
that lasted for 3 hours.
It gets worse than that. The cursing, the disrespect, it is utterly shocking. One group of students shouted out, "We're dying," allegedly referring to the endangered status of Yale's minority students. The kicker is this: the president of Yale, a little bit after this outrageous episode, conferred a racial justice prize on 2 of the participants and said that he'd never been so proud of his student body. And
promised, if I have this correct, and promised to add $50 million to the diversity budget of the university.
Well, that was actually a promise made before, but he reiterated it just to encourage the notion that Yale was trying to erase discrimination at Yale.
And Nicholas Christakis resigned as master of Silliman College.
And his wife resigned as a teacher at Yale completely because they were the then target of vandalism. There was graffiti on their house. At the graduation that year, students refused to shake his hand. This is completely out of control, Peter. And Yale is not alone.
So 2017, a little more recent incident, Claremont McKenna, where you yourself had been invited to speak.
Yes.
I want to come to the reasons for what on earth is going on first, but first I want to establish what is going on, how bad it is, which I have to say, I thought I had an idea, but the book is shocking. Students, you are invited to speak at Claremont McKenna. Students circulate a statement that reads, I'm quoting this because I couldn't make it up. Heather MacDonald is a fascist, a white supremacist, a war hawk, a transphobe, a queerphobe, a classist, and ignorant of interlocking systems of domination that produce the lethal conditions under which oppressed peoples are forced to live.
Yes.
Close quote.
They're ignorant of grammar, but we will leave it aside because colleges are not supposed to teach good writing, right? They're simply supposed to teach victim identity.
So what happened to you when you attempted to speak at Claremont?
Well, the students blockaded the auditorium and didn't let anybody in. I had to be brought in under police escort through a back alley through the kitchen, a secret passageway, but nobody else could get in because about 200 students were outside banging on the plate glass windows. I gave my talk, which was on policing and a counter narrative to the Black Lives Matter nonsense, calumnies against the cops, to an empty room. But the students were still outside banging on the plate glass windows and shouting. And at some point, the police decided they couldn't guarantee my safety any longer. And I was escorted out back through the kitchen into a waiting squad car.
Wow. And disciplinary measures against the kids who broke up, who made it impossible effectively for you to speak to the audience? What happened to the kids?
Well, this was unusual in that there was some discipline, a suspension of a semester for maybe 2 or 3, and a full year suspension for another 2 or 3. Some of the students were from the neighboring Claremont colleges. Claremont itself claims that these were the only Claremont students it could identify. I don't know. I'm not going to second guess them. What I would say, though, is that the faculty are basically passive. They lie down before these things. They should be out there. They've got the privilege of tenure to protect their freedom of speech, not that they use that very much, because, Peter, as you know, any faculty member on a college campus today who is anything other than far left is walking around scared to death. The censorship that's going on is extraordinary.
Including self-censorship is the point you're making now.
Self-censorship. Right. But the faculty are silent before these outbreaks of thuggish, fascist type of behavior.
Right. That's what's happening. How did it happen? How did we reach this point? Let me quote the diversity delusion, Heather. A charged set of ideas now dominates higher education. That human beings are defined by their skin color, sex, and sexual preference, and that discrimination based on those characteristics has been the driving force in Western civilization. These ideas have remade the university, close quote. All right, a touch of intellectual history. Where did these ideas come from, and how did they become ascendant?
It's a very complicated question, Peter, and one can observe the trajectory. The final cause question has to be speculative. Mm-hmm. I can tell you that when I was in college in the 70s, I was susceptible to a totally ridiculous set of ideas that were known as deconstruction and post-structuralism. This was a set of theories about how language and literature works. Unfortunately, I was not critical enough. I bought it hook, line, and sinker.
You were 19 years old.
I was 19, and I was interested in language. Nevertheless, I feel very fortunate in that I was allowed to read, when I was a college student at Yale, Chaucer, Milton, Spencer, and Wordsworth without anyone thinking to complain about their gonads and melanin. Feminism and multiculturalism didn't hit. It came in the 80s.
Right.
At Stanford, where you are now, at Hoover, you had the awful moment of the assault on Stanford's very minimal core curriculum, Jesse Jackson in there leading chants of hey, hey, ho, ho, Western Civ has got to go. And you had this geyser explosion of the idea that students should only read books that conform to their own identity, defined as narrowly and trivially as possible.
Heather, distinguish between the student radicalism of the 60s mm-hmm. and what's taking place today. I find in conversation with friends, there's a little too much willingness to shrug the shoulders and say, oh, well, they're just students. We've gotten used to that kind of the place. Universities are a place for a certain amount of craziness, and that's been going on for half a century. But this is different.
Well, it's the same in that, I think the problem with the 60s is one can make a facially plausible argument that there was grounds to protest the Vietnam War.
Right.
I'm agnostic on that. I'm not going to take a side. But mm-hmm. but that was an idea that had some validity. So, a broken clock is right twice a day. Every so often, student protesters are right. Usually they're not. Usually they don't deserve any attention. Why should I listen to student protesters about capitalism? They've never had a job. They've never run a business. They know nothing about what it's like to try and master a supply chain, to try and understand supply and demand and customer demands. This is an act of entrepreneurial courage that none of these students have. Nevertheless, in the 60s, we all thought, the students, they are tribunals of truth. And from then on, we glorified student protest. And so when it rose up again in the 80s, around these narrow ideas of student victimization, which again is delusional. There's no more privileged human being in history than a college student because he has at his fingertips the thing that Faust sold his soul for, which is knowledge. We still glorify this and say, well, if students at Yale and Princeton say they're victimized by racism, we better do something about it.